They bring progress. They bring order. They bring civilization. That was the promise, spoken in speeches, carved into stone, preached in churches. The colonial project painted itself as light breaking into darkness, a gift to the so-called uncivilized. But behind the words was a harsher truth. For African women, horrific things quickly became normal. Names stripped and replaced with foreign ones, voices silenced in councils and rituals, freedom of movement restricted, their clothing, their speech, even their bodies declared improper, in need of control. The dream of order was, in reality, a cage. A woman might wake before dawn, not to prosper but to endure, living each day in a system that saw her not as a person, but as property. And this was only the beginning. Colonial rule did not just conquer land, it conquered names, memory, and the very idea of who a person was allowed to be. For African women, identity was the first casualty. At birth, a girl might have been given a name with deep meaning, drawn from her lineage, her community, or an ancestral story. That name carried weight. It connected her to generations before her and to the responsibilities of adulthood that would follow. Under colonial rule, those names were dismissed as heathen. Baptism records show rows of women renamed Mary, Elizabeth, Catherine, or Margaret, their African identities crossed out by the pen of a missionary or an official. The change was not simply symbolic. It was a declaration that the old life was gone, and the new one belonged to the colonizer. Renaming was only the surface. Traditional roles, those that had once given women authority, were deliberately dismantled. In many societies, women had been healers, spiritual leaders, and advisors in community councils. Midwives carried knowledge passed down through generations. Priestesses mediated rituals that bound villages together. These roles made women central to both family and public life. But colonial governments and missionary institutions branded them superstitious, illegal, or immoral. Councils were restructured into native authorities dominated by men, often chosen for their willingness to obey colonial orders. Women who once sat at the heart of decision-making were suddenly barred from speaking at all. Daily life became a lesson in exclusion. In schools run by missionaries, girls were taught obedience, silence, and domestic skills. Sewing, cooking, childcare, the idea of women as political actors or intellectual equals was dismissed as dangerous. In some colonies, written codes explicitly banned women from holding office, testifying in certain courts, or owning property independent of their husbands or fathers. A woman who had once inherited land from her mother or served as the voice of her family in a council meeting now found herself reduced to a dependent, expected only to serve and to endure. Religion, too, became a weapon of erasure. Conversion campaigns condemned women's rituals as witchcraft, branding healers and midwives as agents of evil. Sacred groves were cut down, shrines destroyed, and the spaces where women once gathered for ceremony were dismantled. In their place rose churches where sermons preached submission. Women were told that obedience to colonial law and obedience to God were the same thing, that their suffering was part of divine order. Even the act of childbirth, once surrounded by songs, prayers, and communal support, was stripped bare. In mission hospitals, women were forced to give birth under foreign eyes, their traditions shamed, their midwives criminalized. Resistance to this erasure did not vanish, but it carried risks. Women who refused to give up their rituals could be fined, beaten, or imprisoned. Some tried to hide traditions in secret, singing old songs at night, whispering ancestral names to newborns before the missionaries could rename them. But the power of the colonial machine pressed hard. To resist openly was to risk being labelled rebellious, a crime punishable by violence or worse. The humiliation was not always violent, but it was constant. A woman going to market might be forced to wear clothing dictated by missionaries, her body judged against European standards of modesty. A widow might lose her property to a colonial-appointed male relative because the law no longer recognized her rights. A healer who once commanded respect could find herself mocked in public, her tools confiscated, her reputation destroyed. Bit by bit, the threads that connected women to their heritage were cut. For many, the most painful part was silence. To be excluded from the councils where decisions were made, from the shrines where ancestors were honored, from the schools where knowledge was shaped, this was to be rendered invisible. Women who once carried authority now stood at the margins, their opinions dismissed, their traditions outlawed, their power erased. The colonizers' civilization did not elevate them, it erased them, And when their names were taken, their labour was taken too. When the colonial machine demanded wealth, it turned to men first. They were shipped off in chains of labour contracts, mines, plantations, railroads, dragged far from their villages to work for wages so low they could never cover the taxes imposed on them. That burden fell onto the women who were left behind. For them, colonial rule meant a double life. They were mothers and farmers, but now also taxpayers, forced producers, and the backbone of entire households hollowed out by absence. The colonial tax system was designed to bleed families dry. In British East Africa, hut taxes and head taxes demanded payment in cash or produce. If a husband had been sent to a mine hundreds of miles away, his wife was expected to pay in food, firewood, or labour. Markets were warped by this demand. What once had been harvests for a family or a community became harvests for the state. A woman rising before dawn to tend her crops no longer worked to feed her children alone. Her labour was counted, measured, and demanded by the colonizer's ledger. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Congo under King Leopold's rule. There, the rubber quota became a sentence for entire villages. Men disappeared into the forest to strip vines of their sap, while women were held hostage to guarantee their return. Soldiers of the force, public lined women up in villages, threatening them with whips, mutilation, or death if the quotas were not met. Some women were forced to walk miles carrying heavy baskets of rubber to trading posts, their children strapped to their backs, their feet raw from the road. Failure was unthinkable. Punishments included beatings, severed limbs, or the death of a child. To make the point clear, in other colonies, the demands were less openly grotesque but no less punishing. Women were ordered into communal labour, clearing roads, carrying water for military outposts, or cooking for construction crews. Each hour spent labouring for colonial authorities was an hour stolen from their fields and families. The contradiction was brutal. The very women feeding households were also being drained to build the empire that starved them. The physical toll was immense. Farming already meant long hours bent over fields, hands raw from pulling weeds, backs aching from carrying bundles of firewood. Add to that the demand for extra produce to pay taxes, plus the unpaid service exacted by local chiefs acting under colonial orders, and exhaustion became a way of life. Malnutrition followed. Women sometimes skipped their own meals so children might eat. Breastfeeding mothers weakened, infants wasted away, and yet the quotas never eased. Labour was not only physical but psychological. To know that the fruits of your effort would never be yours, that your sweat was measured in taxes, rubber, or grain stolen for export, was a constant humiliation. Songs once sung in the fields to celebrate planting or harvest became laments, heavy with anger and grief. Oral histories tell of women hiding small stores of grain, burying them in secret pits, a quiet act of resistance against the endless drain. The cruelty of the system was that it made survival itself a form of punishment. To live under colonial rule was to labour endlessly and still feel the grip of hunger. To work harder was not to prosper, but to meet a quota that rose again the next season. A woman could break her body in the fields and still face the lash if her tribute was deemed too little. And always, the unspoken threat lingered. If the harvest failed, if the rubber sap ran dry, if the grain sacks fell short, someone would pay. A husband might face the whip, a child might be taken as a hostage, or a woman herself might be dragged into a punishment line, made an example to terrify others into compliance. Under colonial rule, work was not dignity. Work was a weapon used to bind, exhaust, and control, and failure to deliver could cost you more than food, it could cost your life. Colonial conquest was not only about land, taxes, and labour, it was also about bodies. For African women, control often came through sexual violence, systematic, normalised, and enforced with the same authority as law. Behind the polished speeches of civilization and progress, women were reduced to objects of use, their vulnerability exploited in silence. In many colonies, the arrival of soldiers meant the arrival of abuse. Villages were raided not just for food or tribute, but for women. Officers and rank-and-file troops alike treated them as spoils of war. Some were taken openly, marched back to barracks, where they were forced to serve as concubines. Others were cornered in the fields or on lonely roads, violated and then left with no means of justice. Colonial courts rarely recognized the word of African women against European men, and local chiefs installed by colonial authorities were often too frightened or too complicit to intervene. The practice was so common it became woven into the structure of rule. Women were ordered to cook, clean, and serve garrisons, a word that often blurred into expectation of sexual service. In some territories, particularly where soldiers were stationed long-term, women were pressed into unofficial marriages, paired off with men they had never chosen. Officials called it alliance or integration. In reality, it was coercion dressed as partnership. At the political level, women were used to bind chiefs to the colonial system. European administrators encouraged, and sometimes demanded, that chiefs give their daughters in marriage to officials or soldiers as signs of loyalty. To refuse was dangerous. It could mark a leader as uncooperative, a threat to be removed. For the young women offered in these exchanges, choice did not exist. They became bargaining chips in a game of power, their lives tied to the survival of their communities. Resistance was met with punishment. Testimonies from mission records and oral histories recall women flogged for rejecting advances or accused of disobedience if they resisted orders to serve in colonial households. A woman who refused could be branded rebellious, fined, or imprisoned. Worse still, she might bring danger upon her entire village, punished collectively until she submitted. The message was cruelly clear. Consent was irrelevant. Compliance was survival. The violence was not always direct. It lived in laws, too. In many colonies, women were legally tied to their husbands or male relatives, stripped of independent rights to property or wages. If a husband allowed, or demanded, that his wife be given to an official for service, the law offered no recourse. Women existed in the legal system as dependents, never autonomous. That lack of protection created the perfect conditions for exploitation. The trauma ran deeper than the act itself. Sexual violence under colonial rule was not hidden shame, it was spectacle. Women were paraded, humiliated, their resistance broken in front of others to spread fear. Communities learned quickly that silence was safer, that speaking out only brought more suffering. For many women, survival meant enduring quietly, carrying the scars in secret. Yet even silence was resistance of a kind. Oral histories tell of women using songs and coded language to express pain without naming names, to pass down warnings disguised as lullabies or work chants. These were dangerous acts. Songs could be forbidden, gatherings broken up, but they offered small ways to reclaim voice in a world that sought to strip it away. For the colonizer, the violence was about more than satisfaction. It was about dominance. To control a community, they controlled its women. To humiliate a people, they humiliated their mothers, daughters, and wives. Every assault was a message. Your bodies are not your own. Your dignity is ours to break. The consequences rippled for generations. Women bore children fathered by soldiers, often forced to raise them under the gaze of communities that viewed them as living reminders of violation. Families fractured under the weight of shame and silence. Women who endured abuse were sometimes cast aside by their husbands or clans, punished twice, once by the colonizer, once by their own people, and still, the system called this civilization. Behind the rhetoric of uplift and progress, African women carried wounds that no law, no sermon, no colonial record would ever acknowledge. But violence wasn't only physical, it was written into the law itself. The colonizer's violence did not always wear the face of a soldier. Sometimes it wore the robes of a judge, the papers of an administrator, the ink of laws drafted in faraway capitals. For African women, these laws became invisible chains, binding, suffocating, stripping away rights they had once held with certainty. In the name of order, native codes and marriage acts remade entire societies, reducing women from community leaders to legal dependents. Before colonialism, women in many African societies held complex rights. They could inherit land, act as guardians of lineage property, or manage resources for extended families. Marriage often created partnerships that balanced responsibility between households. Divorce, though not always simple, was possible in many traditions, allowing women to leave abusive or unfit husbands. These customs gave women leverage, mobility, and in some cases real authority. Colonial rule swept much of this away. New laws declared that women could not own land independently. In many territories, property was automatically registered under the name of a husband or male relative. A widow, once able to carry on her husband's farm or business, might now find herself dispossessed, her fields seized by male kin or folded into colonial land registers for development. The land that had been her inheritance became a commodity sold to settlers, leaving her with nothing. Marriage codes were another weapon. Missionary and colonial administrations insisted on reshaping marriage into a European mold. Christian weddings, legal certificates, and male heads of household. These laws explicitly placed wives under the authority of their husbands. A woman was no longer seen as an individual but as an extension of her spouse's legal identity. In courts, she could not testify against him. In contracts, her wages or earnings automatically belonged to him. In disputes, his word carried weight, hers carried none. Where women had once been active negotiators in family alliances, they were now written into law as silent dependents. Punishment codes deepened the subjugation. Many colonies introduced native codes that legalized corporal punishment for so-called disobedience. A husband could beat his wife and claim authority under the law. Colonial officers, too, wielded power to order public floggings of women accused of minor offences, refusing forced labour, speaking back to authority, or breaking colonial dress codes. Missionary records and colonial archives describe women tied to whipping posts in public squares, flogged under the gaze of their neighbours, the humiliation as punishing as the pain. These spectacles were meant to send a message. Obedience was not optional, and womanhood was no shield. Even when laws were not explicitly violent, they were structured to make survival impossible without submission. Tax laws demanded payments from households but ignored the labour reality of women left behind when men were sent to mines or plantations. Courts enforced debts against women while denying them the right to own property. In some colonies, women were criminalised simply for living outside the authority of a male guardian, branded as vagrants or prostitutes if they attempted to support themselves independently. Freedom itself was treated as criminal. The intrusion reached even into the intimate sphere of family. Colonial courts often refused to recognise traditional marriages, calling them informal unions. This meant that children born to such unions could be declared illegitimate, stripping mothers of rights and destabilising families. Women who had followed community practices for generations suddenly found themselves branded unlawful in their own homes. The law did not just regulate society, it tore at the roots of identity, declaring entire ways of life invalid. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine standing in court, your land disputed, your children's future at stake, and finding that your voice counts for nothing because you are a woman. Imagine being told that the traditions of your mother and grandmother, which had governed your family for centuries, were now meaningless in the eyes of the state. Imagine carrying the weight of taxes you cannot pay, while knowing that refusal means punishment you cannot escape. These were not abstractions. They were daily realities, repeated across villages and towns for decades. Some women tried to resist within the system. They filed petitions, appealed to sympathetic missionaries, or sought to exploit the contradictions in colonial law. A few managed to carve out exceptions, but most met only silence or dismissal. The law was not written for them. It was written to control them, and yet, control was never perfect. Oral histories recall women mocking colonial courts in secret, calling them the white man's council of lies. Songs circulated that described judges as thieves in robes. In some places, women refused to register marriages at colonial offices, continuing traditional ceremonies in defiance of the law. These acts of resistance, though small, were powerful reminders that beneath the weight of legislation, women still fought to hold pieces of their identity. But the structure remained relentless. Even when resistance flickered, the law crushed it with fines, with floggings, with imprisonment. It reduced African women from citizens of their own societies to dependents of men sanctioned by the state. Their rights as landowners, mothers, leaders, and workers were stripped piece by piece, replaced with the cold certainty of subordination enshrined in statute. The colonizers declared it progress. They called it civilization. But for women, these laws were shackles, written not in ink but in blood, sweat, and silence. And when laws weren't enough, terror filled the gap. When laws failed to break resistance, terror finished the work. Colonial authority relied on fear as much as courts or taxes, and women often bore the brunt of that fear. Their bodies became sites of punishment, spectacles meant to intimidate entire communities into silence. To defy was to invite humiliation, pain, or death. Whippings were among the most common tools. In marketplaces, on roadsides, even in front of mission schools, women accused of disobedience were tied to posts and flogged. Sometimes it was for refusing forced labour, sometimes for speaking against officials. sometimes for no reason beyond the mood of a colonial officer. The lash tore through skin and cloth alike, each stroke not just punishment but performance. Children were made to watch. Husbands were forced to stand by. The message was clear. Obedience was survival. Resistance was pain. Mutilation carried terror even further. In the Congo Free State, where rubber quotas dominated life, women were seized as hostages when men failed to deliver. Soldiers held them for days or weeks, beating or starving them until their husbands or sons brought in the required harvest. If the quota still wasn't met, punishment escalated. Testimonies describe women with hands or feet cut off, their bodies left at village edges as warnings. The violence was calculated, not random. It was designed to turn mothers into messages, to bend whole communities under the weight of horror. Elsewhere, women were forced into public displays of degradation. In German Southwest Africa, women accused of defiance were locked in punishment camps. They were marched through towns in chains, starved, and made to perform exhausting labor until they collapsed. Some were beaten to death, their bodies discarded without burial. In other colonies, women were forced to parade through villages stripped half-naked, jeered at by soldiers and humiliated in front of their families. The cruelty was always public, always staged. Terror worked best when everyone could see. Punishment reached even those who tried only to live quietly. A woman late in paying taxes might be beaten in front of her children. Another accused of hiding food could be dragged into the square and flogged. In settler colonies, women resisting land seizures were sometimes attacked in their own homes, their belongings smashed or burned, their families scattered. Violence became routine, woven into the rhythm of colonial governance. It wasn't the exception, it was the method. And yet, the punishments were never just physical. They were psychological, designed to break the will as much as the body. To be flogged in front of neighbours was to carry shame as well as pain. To be paraded as a hostage was to live with fear long after the body healed. Communities were taught that women could be taken, punished, erased at will. This constant vulnerability hollowed out daily life, leaving women always calculating, always cautious, never secure. But the cycle of terror also revealed its weakness. The more it was used, the more it exposed the colonizers' fear of resistance. Records show that women were often targeted not just for minor offences, but because they were organisers, those who hid food, who passed messages, who whispered songs of defiance. The brutality aimed to cut off resistance at its roots by silencing the women who carried it. Some refused to be silenced. Oral traditions speak of women singing through their punishments, mocking soldiers with coded words. Others carried scars as evidence, showing them to younger generations as proof of cruelty. In places where flogged women were meant to be shamed, their survival became a different kind of power, an embodied memory that testified against the empire itself. Still, the weight of suffering was immense. Entire generations bore scars, both seen and unseen, left by the lash, the chain, the camp. The colonizers called these punishments discipline, as if they were corrections to wayward behavior. In reality, they were tools of terror, meant to grind resistance into submission. But even under the heaviest hand, resistance never vanished. It smouldered in songs, in silences, in everyday acts of defiance waiting to burst into flame. And through all of this, they found ways to fight back. Colonialism sought to break African women through law, labour, and terror, but resistance lived on, in silence, in whispers, in song. Where open defiance meant punishment or death, women turned to the subtle weapons of endurance and memory. They fought not with armies, but with secrets, stories, and strategies that preserved dignity when dignity was forbidden. In villages across West, Central, and East Africa, women gathered quietly at night, away from the eyes of colonial officials and their agents. These meetings were not recorded in archives, but they survived in oral tradition. Women shared food, news, and strategies for survival. They discussed how to hide grain from tax collectors, how to stretch meagre harvests, how to care for children when husbands had been taken to distant mines or plantations. Each gathering was an act of defiance, a refusal to let isolation silence them. Songs became a powerful weapon. Sung while pounding grain, drawing water, or working in fields, they carried coded messages of grief, anger, and endurance. To colonial ears, they sounded like work chants. To the women, they were living testimony. Lyrics disguised in metaphor mocked soldiers, cursed unjust taxes, and remembered the names of ancestors erased by renaming campaigns. A girl raised on these songs would grow up knowing what had been lost, even if the colonizer had outlawed her traditions. Music gave voice where open speech was impossible. Some forms of resistance were quieter still. Women slowed their pace of work, feigned illness, or intentionally damaged tools and baskets to delay production. These acts of sabotage seemed small, but multiplied across villages. They drained the efficiency of the colonial machine. A single woman hiding a portion of grain for her family was a rebellion against starvation. A group of women spreading rumors about shortages could spark panic among tax collectors. Silence, hesitation, and rumor became weapons. Marriage, too, became a site of defiance. Some women refused to accept unions arranged to curry favor with colonial officials. Others fled to relatives in distant villages, rather than submit to forced marriages meant to bind chiefs to European administrators. The cost of refusal was high: beatings, imprisonment, or worse. But every act of resistance disrupted the web of control the colonizer tried to weave through families. There were also moments when quiet defiance erupted into open protest. One of the most striking examples was the Aba Women's War of 1929 in Nigeria. When colonial authorities imposed new taxes and extended control over markets, thousands of women organized mass demonstrations. They sang, danced, and confronted officials directly, overwhelming them with sheer numbers. The protests spread across towns and villages, uniting women across ethnic and social lines. Though brutally suppressed, soldiers opened fire, killing many. The movement revealed the depth of women's political power. They could not vote in colonial councils. They were banned from public authority. Yet in song and in numbers, they forced the empire to take notice. Not all resistance took collective form. Some women preserved oral histories, telling children the stories of ancestors, rituals, and gods that the colonizer declared forbidden. Others continued to use traditional medicines in secret, hiding tools of healing in forests or caves. A midwife who risked punishment to use herbs or prayers in childbirth was not just delivering babies, she was delivering culture itself, keeping it alive under the shadow of empire. Even silence could resist, refusing to answer in a colonial tongue, refusing to kneel when ordered, refusing to betray another woman under interrogation. These small denials asserted humanity when the system insisted on erasure. To refuse was dangerous, but it reminded both the oppressed and the oppressor that domination was never complete. The colonizer relied on fear to control. Women used memory, community, and persistence to endure. The resistance was not always loud, not always victorious, but it was constant. It ensured that even under the heaviest chains, something of identity and dignity survived to pass on. But survival carried scars. The songs and stories kept memory alive, but they also carried the weight of pain, reminders of hunger, loss, and humiliation. The resistance preserved life, but it could not erase the wounds. And those wounds did not heal with independence. The scars remained, passed down through generations. The end of formal colonial rule did not end its wounds. Independence came, flags changed, but the scars etched into African women's lives remained. What colonial authorities had normalized dispossession, violence, and silence did not vanish with speeches of freedom. Instead, it carried forward, reshaping families, economies, and identities long after the empire withdrew. The economic consequences were devastating. Colonial systems had robbed women of land, stripped them of independent rights, and reshaped economies around cash crops and labor for export. When independence came, those structures remained. Women found themselves with little property to inherit, little access to wealth, and a legacy of poverty enforced not just by past theft, but by the laws and customs colonialism left behind. Generations of women struggled against this imbalance, their labor sustaining nations that rarely acknowledged their role. Cultural erasure, too, lingered. Names once replaced by colonial baptisms often remained in families. Languages banned in schools faded across generations. Rituals outlawed for decades were difficult to recover, their songs and practices half forgotten. Women who had once been healers, midwives, and leaders found themselves written out of history, remembered only in fragments of oral tradition. The colonial lie that women belonged in silence stretched its shadow long after the colonizers left. The violence left a legacy as well. Generations grew up in the silence of trauma, children raised by mothers and grandmothers who carried scars too heavy to describe. Sexual violence, once normalized under colonial officers and soldiers, left patterns of abuse and stigma that communities still grapple with. Public punishment and humiliation left not only individual pain but collective memory, teaching whole societies that women's suffering could be dismissed or ignored. Even as laws changed, those habits of silence and dismissal proved harder to uproot. And yet, survival itself was a legacy. The songs women carried in fields, the stories whispered to children at night, the quiet acts of defiance preserved fragments of dignity and culture that could not be erased. Resistance planted seeds. The Aba Women's War in Nigeria, the market protests, the countless unrecorded refusals and sabotages, these moments laid the groundwork for later movements demanding justice and equality. The colonial period sought to silence women, but instead it revealed their resilience, their ability to fight even when every weapon was turned against them. Still, the cost was immense. Colonialism reshaped African societies in ways that continue to wound. For women, the weight was doubled, both as Africans under foreign rule and as women stripped of rights within their own families and communities. Independence restored flags and governments, but it could not immediately restore what was stolen in dignity, land, or memory. The colonial archives recorded taxes, quotas, laws, and punishments. They rarely recorded the cries of women, the weight of hunger, the humiliation of being paraded, the ache of generations forced to forget themselves. Those stories live instead in scars, in silences, in whispered songs that survived when paper and ink refused to. For millions of women, colonialism was not just history, it was a daily nightmare disguised as progress. And its shadows still stretch into the present. Thank you for watching Sins of the Past. If this history moved you, subscribe to the channel because the stories we uncover are the ones the world tried to forget.